Good afternoon. Am I audible? Good afternoon. So nice to see a full house on a Tuesday afternoon for what has been a really wonderfully put together 2 days of discussions, provocations, gatherings, gossip, love, affection shared. Great insights. Thank you so much, Bhavna, Dilpreet, and Manan, for putting this together, for inviting me. And I have to say, for inviting Lavina and me both, who work in textiles and craft. The art world has this very, I often say, flirtatious relationship with textiles and craft, you know. Suddenly when it wants to be seen in a certain way, it suddenly becomes very obsessed with artisanship and craftsmanship, and then it just drops it when it's convenient. And so thank you for actually including a perspective or perspectives from what is often seen a very different ecology and a very different world. And what I thought may be interesting, I just have 10 quick slides. I'm not going to spend so much time on my curatorial process or the way I approach these exhibitions. I'm just going to quickly run through the 10 slides, and then I think it'll be relevant for me to give a very brief introduction into how I actually, came into curating, textile projects, and perhaps then spend a minute on each of the slides. Just to sort of give a flavor of the kind of projects visually that I have had the great privilege of working on. Can it go back to the first slide? पहला slide लगा. Great. So I trained as a textile designer at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad. And some of our faculty at that point were sort of were people who'd actually established the NID in the early 60s. And while we were made to go through a very rigorous program of, how to understand technicalities of print, of weaving, of dyeing, and so on and so forth, what was very interesting was really what happened on campus, because we lived there. And a lot of this faculty, had incredible stories and journeys and experiences to share that actually one really didn't find in curatorial projects or exhibitions or publications. And so at a very early phase of my 4 to 5 years at the NID, I actually got quite attracted to the idea of actually writing about some of these histories. And that's how I actually, when I graduated from the NID, I got interested in writing about textiles. And most importantly, this sort of post-independence period of design, fashion, and textiles, which had been hugely ignored. There had been a lot of emphasis on historical Indian material, pre-19th century material. Scholars had dedicated a lot of effort and time. There were publications, there were large institutions in spaces like the Calico Museum, the National Museum. But nobody was really looking at what was happening as things were sort of being produced, what was really happening, as designers were, evolving formats of production, formats of showing, retail, aesthetics, and aspects like that. So I got very interested in those sort of areas. And when I graduated and sort of tried to generate these kinds of projects, there really wasn't an infrastructure for it. There isn't, even till date, a textile gallery in the country, a gallery, commercial gallery, which is dedicated only to textiles or craft. There are few contemporary galleries that in recent years have started including textile projects in their programming. Except for the Calico Museum, we didn't have a dedicated museum. The Calico Museum in Ahmedabad didn't have a museum that was dedicated to textiles. We have, till date, no single curriculum or suggested learning module for the history of Indian textiles. So as one was grappling all of this, as a maker, as a designer who was looking to read about things in the post-independence period, in what is often seen as the contemporary or modern period, there was really nothing. And I was having these restless conversations. I had a studio that we worked with handmade textiles, largely for interiors. Some of it was for apparel, not necessarily fashion, that we were exporting. And one was having very restless and sort of urgent conversations with friends in Delhi. I was based in Delhi. And many of them sort of started saying, do something about this. It's not enough that you're complaining and pointing out this gap. And actually, that's the entry. At some point, they encouraged me. There were several individuals. Many of them are here. So happy to see them here. And they started encouraging me to sort of look at questions of exhibition making, showing in a non-commercial context, writing about things. I had no real formal training in curation, except really this need to bring in a maker's perspective rather than academic or historian's perspective. So among my very early projects was actually something that, because I was always at Khoj, my workshop was very close to Khoj, and I was always at these openings having chai and momos. And Pooja was like, enough, stop complaining about this and let's develop something. So we developed a small residency called on art and fashion. I had a small studio where my first client had been Lekha Poddar. We had done some textiles for their hotels and interior projects that they were helming. And Lekha and Anupam said, stop complaining again and let's do something. So we developed a curatorial project called Fracture, of which you see this wonderful work that was a collaboration between a fourth-generation Kalamkari artist, Sri Niranjan, and a Paris-based textile designer, Berenice Elena, who had been working with Kalamkari for the French luxury brand Hermès for about 20 years. I'll talk about this a little later. And there was Ritu Sethi who said, come on, write. Ritu Sethi runs the Craft Revival Trust, which is the largest craft resource or directory in the world. And she said, why don't you write something, And so there were a bunch of, really supportive people who said, let's do something about this. So I feel like today today that I am this sort of independent curator working with individuals and organizations that are involved with textiles, it's very difficult to grapple with the question of who's patron, who's curator, because I think all of us started working and doing things together from a need to do something larger for the textile world and to situate it in larger artistic and cultural conversations that we found were missing. And at the same time to try and address those gaps, And so in that sense, I think that my journey has been not so much actually about formally working with the institutions that these individuals, have created, but it's actually been about these individual connects and carrying forward certain areas of mutual interest and to find ways to sustain those conversations. So this is a 5.5 meter kalamkari hand painted in Andhra Pradesh, which was commissioned over a 2.5 year period for Fracture, Indian Textiles, New Conversations. It was a series of commissions and an exhibition that was commissioned by the Devi Art Foundation. And I was one of the 3 co-curators, including the eminent Indian textile historian Rahul Jain, and now the very well-known fashion and textile designer Sanjay Garg of Raw Mango. This was in 2015, and Bhavna, I had the studio I had an office close to you, so we developed Take on Design. So these were the kind of this period where, you know, these... So these were sort of, yeah, so there was this sort of ecology of interest, you know, friends, and we started talking and let's do something about this. Another project that I worked on with the Devi Art Foundation was called A Search in 5 Directions. It was a project in which I wrote the text for the catalogue. It was an exhibition which was curated and presented at the Crafts Museum in Delhi in honor of Mr. Mayank Singh, who was a very well-known textile expert and passed away at the age of 70, a great mentor to all of us and a great friend and colleague in the world of textiles. And it allowed me a chance to actually look at a very specific aspect, not as a curator, but as a writer of the catalogue. The curators were Rahul Jain, Rakesh Thakur, and Rita Kapoor Chishti, who were actually, who were proteges of Mr. Mayank Singh. And so they curated the project, which was commissioned and presented by the Devi Art Foundation. And it allowed me to look at a very specific period of this post-independence history that I was looking at, which was a 10-year period called the Festivals of India, which was state-supported textile projects and exhibitions that were sent all over the world, but which were also used as part of cultural diplomacy initiatives initiated by the Union Government of India then, but which also acted as a catalyst to document the lesser-known living traditions of textiles in India, to reproduce some museum quality masterpieces that, you know, weren't being produced at that point in the field. So this was another project that I was associated with the Devi Art Foundation. Another more recent project is a series of 3 exhibitions that the Devi Art Foundation and I have collaborated on, which actually specifically look at weaving. Because we felt that now there was an ecology and there's a tremendous visitorship to textile exhibitions, but technical jargon is very difficult, you know, to grasp. So we said, why don't we do a simple series of exhibitions, simple in the sense that, which would be introductory about weaving techniques, which would allow people, you know, or equip them with the devices to know a little more about the textiles at a technical level. And to know about them technically is to also appreciate them at a different level than just aesthetically or visually. So the first part of the exhibition was an exhibition on muslin. It was called Fine Count, Indian Cotton Textiles. The second part of the exhibition was called Vayan, the Art of Brocades. And the third exhibition will open mid-January, again at the Crafts Museum, which is going to focus on ikat. And this allowed us a very interesting format to actually, because it was a time that we were looking at the collection of the Devi Art Foundation and Lekha Podar textiles. And the Crafts Museum had also called us to actually look at their reserve collection, which had never been made public ever. And it is perhaps the second most important and largest public collection of textiles in the country after the National Museum, but except for the permanent gallery, which had not changed until recently, for almost 20-25 years, the reserve collection, which is thousands of textiles, had never been seen. So it became an interesting opportunity to actually collaborate between a private and a public institution to show textiles, which also focused on the connection between what I was interested in, the contemporary and modern period, with the immediate period before that, which is the 19th century, hugely ignored because there's been an obsession with the 17th, 16th, 18th century and so on. So with each question, what I'm sharing is this: while there's been a kind of conversation with an individual like Lekha Podar, who actually becomes very involved with the curation, the curatorial aspect, the design aspects, and you know, in many ways the sort of roles between who's curator and, you know, patron sort of dissolve. What has been very interesting is the carry forward of these conversations and how these opportunities have allowed us to think about, so in this context, the connections that the contemporary or post-independence period has with the immediate past. Another project most recently that the Devi Art Foundation and I collaborated on was presented in Hampi as part of the G20 Third Culture Work Group meet at a very ambitious and very, very beautifully conceived art residency, which is coming up in Hampi, in Vidyanagar, within the Jindal Steel Township. It was commissioned by the Ministry of Culture, the Government of India, and supported and executed executed, yeah, by the Jindal Foundation, by the JSW Foundation. And we had the chance to show some textiles that we had commissioned for fracture again, and to think about them and recurate them. So with these 5 projects, there has been a kind of continuity of conversation that has happened over 15 years. And therefore, I think that in this context, what becomes really interesting is the connection with that Mrs. Podar and I have shared, someone who's seen me move from a maker to curating, but also kind of keeping this idea of what it means to curate as a maker in mind. Just before why I think it became possible for me to write about Mr. Mayank Singh and his journey and the exhibition on his body of work through Vishwakarma that I spoke about earlier, In Search of 5 Directions, was because I had actually was on the curatorial team for an exhibition that had been sent immediately after he passed away that summer to Japan. It was at a design space in Tokyo called 2121, and it was hosted by the architect Tadao Ando and the designer Issei Miyake. And this showed another aspect of Mr. Mayank Singh's work, which was a project originally called Khadi, the Fabric of Freedom, in 2001 and 2002, which traveled to 4 cities of India. And we had the chance to revive that collection in the Japanese context. And quite soon after, when the collection came back, we had the chance to actually place it with a very new organization in Bangalore called the Registry of Saris, that had been set up to actually create a study center and a collection of Indian saris focused, but also very specifically to invite curatorial projects on Indian textiles to South India. That was because the sense was that a lot of this kind of exhibition making and presentation was taking place in North India. So it was very consciously conceived to invite those kinds of curatorial projects in textiles to South India. And we did a series of 3 projects with this collection. We re-looked at the title as Meanings, Metaphors, Handspun and Handwoven in the 21st Century. And we presented it in Chirala, a weaving village in Andhra Pradesh, where about 4,000 weavers became the audience for this exhibition. The second iteration was in Coimbatore, of which you see an installation image, which we presented in a 125-year-old textile mill, the Lakshmi Mill. And we could show these 108 textiles at their performative best. And here it was very interesting because one had the chance to carry forward an earlier conversation that had been established with Devi Art Foundation on Mr. Mayank Singh's work. But it was to be sort of, and then with the Tokyo exhibition, but then we had the chance to take it to spaces where no non-commercial textile exhibition had ever traveled to. So it was very interesting to engage with the audience that sort of came to expect an exhibition where they could buy saris, but, you know, it was educational in that sense. The conversations over saris continued with the second project exhibition that I curated for the Registry of Saris, where we, over 5 years, we actually put together a collection of saris from the late 19th century to the pre-Vishwakarma period. And the exhibition was called Red Lilies, Water Birds, the Sari in 9 Stories, and we presented this in Hampi, mainly again to an audience of artisans and craftspeople in Karnataka. And we housed the exhibition in a village in local houses. And the idea was really to take these archival textiles to places where they have actually been originally produced, some of them. So the conversation with Registry of Saris sort of then started, and it was a nascent organization, and then we sort of worked together. It was founded and established by Ahalya Mathan, who's a perfumer by profession but loves textiles, and wanted to address this gap of having this kind of a space in South India or Bangalore, where it is based, where there could be a textile collection to study. It's a very big difference between seeing a film on 1,000 counts muslin, cotton, and talking about how it's as, soft as wind, or it's as, thin as mist, but to actually hold 1,000 count cotton. And that was the whole idea of setting up a collection at the Registry of Saris, and then to curate it and to take it to artisan centers. Coming back to my interest in contemporary period, I had established a very early conversation where I was still at school at the NID with Monisha Ahmed, Dr. Monisha Ahmed, who gave a wonderful presentation yesterday, and she sent me to Banaras to research something called the Gyasar. And this was in my second year college, and the weavers won't teach me because they actually don't teach at that point. They didn't want to teach beyond the family. So I instead ended up learning something called the Tanchoi in the Weaver Service Center there. And several years later, when we re-established contact, Dr. Ahmed at that point was associate editor at Marg Foundation, the publication house, and she got interested, and she invited me to consider guest editing a special issue on the post-independence period of Indian textiles. We had again Ritu Sethi contribute. So in that sense, it's been very interesting, the trajectory, because I've seen all of these sort of continuities of engagements, of interests, of subjects, themes, not as part of, large institutions or organizations, but as those personal connects where we are able to collaborate and sort of complete things rather than compete. And that led me to then, that became sort of the basis of, it was part of a sort of direction that Marg was trying to chart out at that point, to also include subjects of contemporary relevance. And that allowed me sort of create a framework and a way to engage with and enter and to understand my own interest in this post-independence period of Indian textiles. And that became the basis for an exhibition that I curated at the Jawahar Kala Kendra when Pooja Sood was the director. So she had asked me to, get over my inhibitions and curate something at Khoj almost 6 or 7 years back. I had been part of something called ATSA, Art Thing South Asia, that she had helmed and led and mentored. And then when she was at the JKK and commissioning interesting projects outside of only the visual arts field that included architecture, performing arts, ceramics, she suggested we do something on textiles, and I pitched this idea, and she said, let's do it. It was called New Traditions, Indian Textile, Inspirations and Influences in Indian Textiles, 1947 to 2007. It was an exhibition in 2018. And allowed me to sort of further that interest and deepen my engagement with the subject. And finally, when Lavina was conceiving of Sutra Santati as a way to mark the 75 years of India's independence at the National Museum last year through textiles, she invited me very graciously to co-curate the exhibition with her at the point where her own curatorial vision and selection of textiles was so clear and was so fantastically different from the kind of aesthetic that I had sort of been involved in shaping through my exhibitions, that we decided it might be best for me to write the catalog and the text for the exhibition, but the dialogue continued, because here we were looking at 75 years of India's textiles, but through the lens of what is being produced today, and largely through the lens of the figurative, which has never been something that I looked at in a very, very sort of conscious way, because I was trained and I worked within the kind of international modernist sort of milieu that NID had sort of got involved in, and then producing for international markets had allowed me to also look at producing products that would have international legibility without really being overtly Indian. So here was an opportunity to actually understand how important the figurative color, the use of gold, a certain kind of taste that one hadn't sort of been very familiar with, or they hadn't really tried to understand the reasons, behind, or to engage with the kind of practitioners that were producing that kind of work. So I think for me, that's been really, that's really what I want to contribute, or if I want to contribute to this discussion, I wanted to kind of share that it hasn't really been very conscious, because all of us who work in textiles, Ritu Sethi is here, Monisha is here, Lekha is here. A very interesting project that I got involved in 5 years back was with Rasika Vakalkar from Pune, who was here, who came to me a few years back and said, 7-8 years back, and said, you know what, I want to create an app that a person can read one article every night on the history of Indian fashion. And I started writing text for that. The application never saw, it never really finally, came into the market. But we developed a friendship and started talking about the lack of histories of textiles in the Deccan. So TWAM, the foundation that Rasika set up, actually is looking at textile histories hugely ignored of the Deccan textile traditions, like the Paithani, Kodali Karupur that Lavina spoke about, the Chanderi, Maheshwari, Mashru, Himru. So this has been the sort of nature of conversations. At a very early stage of my career, Dr. Mehta of the Bhawdaji Museum invited me to start teaching at the module they have, which looks at the contemporary and modern history of Indian textiles. And my module would always be the last. It was titled Contemporary Expressions in Traditional Practices. And a few years later, where there was a conversation and great sense of strength, I felt that, HERS was an institution that recognized the importance of design histories. Monisha and I had the chance to actually work on digitizing and cataloging the textile collection at the Bhawdaji Museum. So I feel like that's really been the nature of my trajectory. I don't think in terms of large institutions, power dynamics, all of these very, very big words that have been used in the last 2 days, important words that are important to engage with, but it's been really at a level of individual connection and with the spirit of collaboration, and to come together to actually try and do something larger for the Indian textile field, to create the human infrastructure, the human and the physical infrastructure for Indian textiles. So sorry I took a little longer. I've just been emerging from an illness, and sorry if I was a little slow. But thank you so much, and yeah.